moving on to disarmament. And there are a few things which we need to keep in mind. First of all, that disarmament was an extension of the liberal ideology of the age, this optimism about the league system and a moral-based world order rather than a balance of power-based world order. That it was already included within the peace treaties. After all, the Germans were required to field an army no greater than 100,000 men, which was very small by the standards, and were prohibited from building submarines, tanks, or aircraft. Or fielding in the Air Force specifically. Civilian airplanes were allowed. So, what was this timeline of disarmament? So initially we have a lot of optimism. The Washington Naval Agreements come into force. This includes an agreement between America, Britain, France, and Japan to cooperate in the Pacific, as well as a non-power agreement which establishes an open door policy in China and gives the Chinese Republic some of its sovereignty back. But without a doubt, the most important agreement is the Five Power Agreement, because this will be the one where disarmament actually does something, because it sets restrictions on how many ships can be built by major powers and what type of ships can be built. There are tonnage restrictions. So for an example, that a battleship can be no bigger than, let's say, 20,000 tons displacement. That's the max. Or there are restrictions about the sizes of guns that various ships can carry. And all the diplomats of the British, the French, and the Americans are happy with this agreement. The American and the Japanese navies are generally not happy because the Americans wanted a ratio that was more favorable for the United States. So 10-10-6-3-3, with basically the British having 10 ships for every 10 American ships, and the Japanese having only 5. Sorry, I meant 10-10-5-3-3. While the Japanese Navy wanted the opposite. They wanted a bit of a better ratio than 5-5-3, 1.5-1.5. They wanted 10-10-7-3-3. This is despite the fact that this agreement at 5-5-3 was extremely beneficial for them because Japan didn't even have the industrial capability to build up a large enough navy to reach this limit in the foreseeable future. So basically the British and the Americans are very happy with this agreement overall because they have these giant navies lying around and they don't have to waste more money on building larger ones because they're not forced to competition with each other. As a matter of fact, the British were already kind of embracing this world where the Americans would have a larger naval presence even before World War I. For example, by withdrawing the West Indies squadron and just leaving the Caribbean for the Americans to protect with the Monroe Doctrine, or actually encouraging and supporting the Americans in their acquisition of the Philippines by providing basing and refueling for American vessels, because that would keep the Germans out of the Pacific. So the Americans were also happy that an arms race between the two of them could be avoided. And we now have this, and Japan, Japan should be happy because now they're equals in the Pacific. Because of course the Americans and the British have bigger fleets, but the Americans and the British have to keep a significant portion of their fleets in different places. The Americans have 2 oceans to control, not one, and the British have colonies all over the world. So, as a matter of fact, the Japanese Navy hoped that it could beat the U.S. Pacific Fleet before the Atlantic Fleet could arrive. As a matter of fact, it's also important to consider that American ships were limited by the fact that they had to be able to cross the Panama Canal, which the Japanese were hoping to exploit by mounting, making bigger battleships with bigger guns than the Americans, because the battleships at this point were considered to be the most important element of naval warfare. Aircraft carriers were a novelty at this point. And the Japanese were also making much more significant investments into their fleet They weren't just like, running around on old World War I destroyers. They were making major innovations. Like, for example, the Fubuki class destroyer, which was introduced in the 1920s, outclassed anything that existed in the world. And new ships were being made constantly. And just for you to understand what was the scale of these major naval powers, there was this one incident where the commander of a U.S. destroyer squadron in the fog crashed 5 destroyers into the California coast. And the result was that, this was all over the press, but nobody really cared, and they simply just got 5 destroyers out of storage. By comparison, the Polish Navy was only able to build like 4 or 5 destroyers during the entire existence of Poland. Destroyers being the smallest type of naval ship capable of operating on the high seas. And you have a Fubuki class destroyer pictured on the slide. Anyway, in addition to that, you can see that the treaty also included the French and the Italians. And the French were not happy at all, because the treaty made them look as if they were Italy's equals, and they would constantly undermine it by, for example, building submarines, which were not covered by the treaty, and this made them look like, bullies trying to undermine the world order. That was what most people thought of the French at the time. And while the Italians were very happy because they were treated as France's equals, despite, normally, historically being considered a less important power than the French. Anyway, a number of other things happened. In 1930, we get the London Conference, which basically is like an upgrade to the 5-power agreement of the Washington Naval Conference. But by the 1930s, we already see that this attitude is beginning to fade. In 1936, when there is a second round of the London Treaty, it collapses because Japan and Italy refused to sign the treaty, and restrictions collapsed. The naval powers had been, working around the treaty for a long time. Like the Japanese had been lying about the actual tonnage of their ships by providing like somewhat false schematics to inspectors, and by, for example, they were building ships which could be mounted with bigger guns in times of war by having their turrets replaced. And and everybody was trying to work around it. Like the Americans were building ships which were somewhat unstable so that they could fit more stuff on them. It was already being undermined, but by this point it effectively collapses. And 2 more important things in disarmament. The Kellogg-Bryant Pact Denouncing War in 1928, signed by a lot of states. They renounced war, but that didn't mean anything. It was just, an announcement that they made for the press. In 1932, they had an option to actually, show that there was some progress for global disarmament, because the Geneva Disarmament Conference came around, where a lot of disarmament was, for pretty much everything was discussed, for tanks, conventional weapons, or artillery, everything, aircraft, everything like that. But the Geneva Disarmament Conference achieved pretty much nothing. It was a complete flop, and they failed to stop disarmament on land. This is despite the fact that, Germany was even under Hitler's control at this point, right? The only real menace that we have is, Italy, and Italy wasn't even really seen as that much of a menace at this point by the rest of the world, and, and Japan, which is, becoming increasingly militarized. It's also important to remember that this is a repeat of pre-World War I, because before World War I, we also had a disarmament movement, an international disarmament movement, and a lot of states participated in order to, to look good for the press, but these went nowhere because no politicians treated them seriously. It was different here, because this stuff like the Washington Naval Agreement, it was treated seriously for 2 reasons. Because first of all, there was a lot of more optimism about the moral-based world order, and second of all, because these states really wanted to avoid this arms race. They didn't want to waste more money on arms after World War I. But as you guys see, in the end of the day, despite initial successes in the naval field, disarmament all collapsed over time, and outside of that naval field, there was no progress at all.